The following presentation is brought to you by Discovery Education, leading the world of digital and video learning. Discovery Education. Connect to a world of learning.
Every president of the United States takes an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the nation they serve. The pledge demands courageous and difficult decisions. When bold leaders risk all to do what they see as right, their choices can change the course of history. These are the decisions that shook the world.
We all make tough choices, but when you're sitting in the Oval Office as President of the United States, the decisions you make will affect millions of people. Imagine it's 1980 and you're Ronald Reagan. You've just won the presidency promising confrontation with the Soviet Union. You believe your approach is the best way to end the Cold War. But a lot of people think you'll be risking a nuclear war. Do you stick with what you believe or listen to critics telling you to back off?
Communism, the greatest hoax of the century, was perpetrated on the world to cover and mask nothing more nor less than a program of Russian aggression and expansion.
We must go forth from here united, determined. There is no substitute for victory.
Since the dawn of the nuclear age, the United States and the Soviet Union have been locked in a dangerous power struggle. The threat has been nothing less than global annihilation. Now, Americans have elected a new president, one who is prepared to take a radically different and dangerous approach. In December of 1980, as Ronald Reagan prepares to assume office, the former actor turned Cold Warrior is determined to make good on his long-held convictions.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Reagan had very clear ideas about what he wanted to do about the Soviet Union for a very long time. He felt that the only way you get another side to negotiate and take you seriously is to build up your power, threaten them, make them fear you, and then they're going to bargain in a serious way. He felt that for a long time American presidents had not done that. Now was his time to try.
Now Reagan finds himself faced with the biggest decision of his political career. He can either back away from his anti-Soviet campaign rhetoric or try and break the stalemate of the Cold War through confrontation, a choice which could lead to unimaginable destruction.
Ronald Reagan entered office with an agenda. He didn't just want to be president. He wanted to be president because there were things he wanted to do.
And his basic idea was that if they want an arms race, we will have an arms race, and we are so powerful economically that they won't be able to keep up.
Reagan formed his political views at the height of the Cold War, when the world's two great military powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, were locked in a desperate battle for nuclear superiority.
I think Reagan always believed that the only way that you were going to resolve this was with strength.
Fears of a communist attack reached a terrifying climax with the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the United States and the Soviet Union stood on red alert, facing each other across the nuclear abyss. President Kennedy called the Russians bluff, but like many hardcore conservatives, Ronald Reagan still believed the Democrats had been too soft on the Soviets.
I have spent most of my life as a Democrat. I recently have seen fit to follow another course.
In his political debut, endorsing presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, Reagan rallied the Republican audience with a message that would remain unchanged throughout his career.
When Nikita Khrushchev has told his people that we're retreating under the pressure of the Cold War, he believes this because from our side he's heard voices pleading for peace at any price. or better read than dead, or as one commentator put it, he'd rather live on his knees than die on his feet. Those voices don't speak for the rest of us. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery.
Reagan's message electrified America's conservatives. In 1976, after serving 2 terms as California's governor, Reagan came very close to snatching his party's presidential nomination from the incumbent President Gerald Ford. On the last night of the convention, Ford invited Reagan to the podium. Speaking without notes, Reagan's heartfelt address was not what the delegates expected.
We live in a world in which the great powers have poised and aimed at each other horrible missiles of destruction, nuclear weapons that can in a matter of minutes arrive in each other's country and destroy virtually the civilized world we live in.
I think he seriously believed that Armageddon could happen. And that was the basic theme. He didn't talk about welfare reform or about the economy, and he never mentioned Ford's name either. He talked about nuclear weapons.
In 1979, as he prepared another run for the White House, Reagan had another revelation deep in the heart of the Rocky Mountains. He visited the top-secret military installation, NORAD, Defense Command for North America.
He was going out to NORAD, and I drew the short straw. I got to fly out on that particular trip. And all I remember is that we get out there, and we were briefed the whole day. And at the end of the day, we were sitting in the general's office.
Here, Reagan learned a terrible truth.
Reagan said, "What could we do to defend ourselves if the Soviets ever launched a nuclear strike attack?" He was told nothing.
Reagan was fully aware of the fact that we had no defense against an incoming nuclear missile. I think we all did, but it kind of reinforced it to have the general of this incredible facility say that we're helpless.
And the fact is that Reagan's left that briefing thinking there should be some alternative besides getting this fabulous information real quickly. He wanted, in essence, a button for the president that would not just retaliate against the Soviet people or whoever launched the missiles, but would protect the United States.
Reagan's trip to NORAD would plant the seeds of a bold idea and a decision that would prove pivotal in bringing an end to the Cold War. But first, he had to win the Oval Office.
During a time when the Soviet Union may enjoy nuclear superiority over this country, we must never waver in our commitment to our allies, nor accept any negotiation which is not clearly in the national interest.
With a deep awareness of the responsibility conferred by your trust, I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
In 1980, on his second try for the presidency, Reagan won his party's nomination.
Governor Ronald Reagan and Mrs. Nancy Reagan.
In the campaign of 1980, he stood alone on a great many issues. And he told the American people basically where he stood.
As the 1980 election neared, the ongoing hostage crisis in Iran only reinforced America's perceived weakness overseas.
We must ask ourselves, is America more secure? Are we more confident of peace in the world than we were just 4 years ago?
The voters embraced Reagan's message of peace through strength. And on November 4th, 1980, Ronald Reagan was swept into office.
You know, Abe Lincoln, the day after his election to the presidency, he said, "Your troubles are over now. Mine have just begun."
And after the election, Nixon was happy to come in and say to Reagan, you know, all of those things you've been talking about were interesting, but we really have to get back to dealing with these people in a realistic way.
We did need to have a much stronger position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union because they were relentlessly building an awesome military machine, and it did have a real effect on not only the military balance, but on the psychological balance with allies in Europe and around the globe.
The day after his inauguration, Ronald Reagan makes his foreign policy clear. In his first press conference as president, he makes his case for confronting rather than appeasing the Soviets.
stand to.
Mr. President, what do you see as the long-range intentions of the Soviet Union? Do you think, for instance, the Kremlin is bent on world domination that might lead to a continuation of the Cold War? Or do you think that under other circumstances, détente is possible?
Well, so far, détente's been a one-way street that the Soviet Union has used to pursue its own aims. The only morality they recognize is what will further their cause, meaning they reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat, in order to attain that, and that is moral, not immoral. And we operate on a different set of standards.
And everybody said, oh my God, this is great stuff for a radio announcer or a political speaker, but for a new president, this is just astonishing.
Oh, I don't think there's any question that early on Reagan wanted the Soviets to know by both what he was saying and in other actions that this was a new era and somebody who had firm beliefs and was not going to back down.
But just 70 days into his presidency, all his plans will be put on hold in one terrible moment.
Mr. President!
He was very close to death, not once but twice. Once the bullet, but then he developed an infection, and the infection really almost killed him. They kept that very quiet.
The White House basically says the president had a close call, but he's fine. Nothing has changed. In fact, in private, a lot has changed. Reagan knows how close he had come to death. It changes him in a way that has enormous consequences.
Reagan really felt he had been preserved after the shooting for a divine purpose, and that purpose was to rid the world of communism, and that purpose was to at least lower, if not get rid of, nuclear weapons.
If you feel that you've been spared by God for a great purpose, you tend to be a little bit more confident of your own intentions. Before the shooting, Reagan would be guided by the foreign policy pros who would say, Mr. President, this is not the way it's done. After the shooting, he was a lot more sure of himself.
6 days after he had come out of the hospital, he wrote his own letter, Soviet leader Brezhnev.
Is it possible that we have permitted ideology, political and economic philosophies, and governmental policies to keep us from considering the very real, everyday problems of our peoples?
The staff didn't think much of it. I think the basic attitude was, what in God's name is the president doing writing a letter to Brezhnev? The president's not supposed to do this.
People were very dubious about this guy's ability to deal on the world stage. He had no experience at all. He was still basically a former actor.
By the summer of 1981, the Russians were still trying to gauge how seriously do we take Reagan, and that's when something happened that gave them a very good idea.
Fed up with low wages and long shifts, 15,000 of America's air traffic controllers walk off their jobs, paralyzing the nation.
Our people are firm. Our people are solid. We'd rather face this issue right now. I thank every controller in this country who stood by us.
The cabinet meets in an emergency meeting in the morning, and there's a lot of give and take around the table, and nobody notices that the president is not really listening, but is writing on his famous yellow legal pad. And after 15 or 20 minutes of everybody ignoring the president, Reagan says, excuse me, but would you just listen to this for a minute?
This morning at 7 a.m., the union representing those who man America's air traffic control facilities called a strike.
15 minutes later, he was in the Rose Garden reading his yellow pad. That became the policy.
They are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
And what we now know is that in Moscow, the people in the Kremlin were looking at this and saying, holy cow, Reagan is absolutely serious about what he's saying. If he did this to the air traffic controllers, he'll do that to us.
As he begins his second year in office, Reagan puts the Soviets on notice, ratcheting up his rhetoric.
The objective I propose is quite simple to state. The march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people.
It was a very tense period. There's still a lot of things that historians need to find out about this, as to how much the Soviets believed Reagan. And I think they were almost in some ways afraid of him.
Reagan hopes his tough talk will force the Soviets to negotiate a reduction in nuclear arms. But his risky strategy has another effect on the public. On June 13, 1982, over 2 million people show up for an anti-nuclear demonstration in Central Park.
I am ordering your arrest at this time for disorderly conduct.
They're demonstrators from 34...
Reagan offers no response. Instead, he continues to challenge the very legitimacy of the Soviet Union.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
Then in March of 1983, Reagan decides to raise the stakes with a new initiative that the Soviets could never have imagined. It is called SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, or as its detractors would call it, the Star Wars program.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
Overstating it a bit, it was like it was on the grocery shelf and all we had to do was have the will and the money and it was here. And of course 24 years later we still don't have it, and we will one of these days, but he was way off in his time frame. He was very naive on that, but he was dedicated to SDI.
Many of the Russians said the only reason that Reagan could be developing SDI is because he intends a first-strike nuclear attack against the Soviet Union, and he doesn't want retaliation. That was about as dangerous as could be.
Adding to the Soviet fears of a first strike, Reagan also authorizes the deployment of American Pershing II nuclear missiles in West Germany.
Does he really mean it? Tough rhetoric, huge buildup, seemingly moving toward nuclear confrontation. People in this country were very concerned about it. People in Europe were concerned about it, and if the Soviets, if I perceive them correctly, they were very concerned about it.
On September 1st, 1983, a commercial Korean jetliner is shot down over Russian airspace. Although the Soviets initially deny responsibility, Reagan's reaction is immediate.
This crime against humanity must never be forgotten. Despite the savagery of their crime, the universal reaction against it, and the evidence of their complicity, the Soviets still refuse to tell the truth. They have persistently refused to admit that their pilot fired on the Korean aircraft.
Reagan said this is an example of the fact that it's the Soviet Union at war with the world that ratcheted up the competition between the two countries, increased the danger of nuclear war.
In the wake of the airliner shooting, air traffic to the USSR is virtually non-existent. But a private citizen named Suzanne Massey boards a plane for Moscow, determined to continue her research on the cultural history of Russia.
There was nobody on the plane but me. When we landed, and this is a sight never will I forget, there was not one soul in a huge airport. 2 or 3 sad-looking soldiers sitting there watching. Nobody. Because nobody was flying. Relations were just absolutely at nadir.
With official lines of communication down between the superpowers, the Soviets are trying back-channel routes to send a message to the United States. Massey finds herself in the unlikely position of messenger when she is summoned to a meeting with a KGB general.
He pounded his fist on the table, looked at me with his really flashing black eyes and said, "You don't know how close war is."
I remember once I asked Reagan, what would he have done if the Soviets had launched an attack on the United States? Would he have responded? And he said yes, there would have been Armageddon.
Reagan stayed the course. He kept on saying to himself, the only way the Soviets will bargain is if I scare them with American power. He kept it up.
Reagan knows from intelligence reports that the Soviet economy is hitting a crunch point, and there are signs of unrest in the provinces.
I would at times argue with Ronald Reagan that the Soviet Union was not going to collapse. And I remember saying to him several times, all of us experts, we thought we knew a lot more than Reagan, and it happened that he was right and we were wrong.
Word reaches Reagan about Suzanne Mass's encounter with the KGB. And in January of 1984, he agrees to her request for a meeting.
Nice to see you again. How are you? So glad to see you.
Reagan would invite Massey to the White House regularly to help expand his knowledge of the land she knew so well.
Oh, thank you. I was trying to give him a picture of a country that was not a monolithic group of communists marching in lockstep. That on the contrary, it was enormously varied, that it was for any Soviet leader enormously difficult to deal with this essentially ungovernable people. The variety was something, and that's what I really tried to give him a sense of.
People are always looking for clues into what a leader really believes in private. Reagan in his heart knew that he was challenging the Soviet Union so that he could bargain and try to end the Cold War, but most Americans did not know that.
In August of 1984, while doing a mic check for a radio address, Ronald Reagan let slip a controversial joke.
All right, my fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
The radio gaffe only reinforces the public's perception of Reagan as a trigger-happy cowboy. As the 1984 election approaches, Democratic candidate Walter Mondale gains momentum.
We're in this together. It's not just my cause, it's our cause.
Voters are nervous over Reagan's anti-Soviet saber-rattling. Despite concerns over his policies, Reagan's popularity wins him re-election by a landslide.
He had always wanted a Soviet leader that he could deal with. Now he was about to have that.
In March of 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power. He's a new breed of Soviet leader, an advocate for reform. He immediately agrees to a summit meeting with Reagan.
President Reagan always liked to take the measure of his opposite number in personal terms. So the first opportunity was at the Geneva summit meeting.
Are you up to going one-on-one with Mr. Gorbachev?
As I told you, you can't be tougher than Errol Flynn.
So the first visuals of the summit are Ronald Reagan walking down the steps. Out of the limousine in a Russian coat is Mikhail Gorbachev. He has a hat on, he has a scarf on. Reagan doesn't have his overcoat, and this is November of '85. So you have a fellow Ronald Reagan who's a generation older than Gorbachev, looking like $1 million Mikhail Gorbachev. This little man from this decrepit kind of empire. Gorbachev does something that is nice, but it played right into Reagan. He starts pointing to the difference of their overcoats.
It was a stunning image. I was watching this in the Soviet Union with a lot of friends. They had never seen Reagan on television. He had never been shown. When he came out like that, you should have heard the comments. They said, "Oh, what a country is America. That man, 75, and he's out there coatless, hatless."
He knew that that picture would go around the world and suggest not only that he was at the top of his game, but also that America was too.
When he started having a dialogue with Gorbachev, he basically felt he was someone he could deal with, and he frankly fought off within his own administration some people who believed that this was just the same old Soviet leader with a better smile.
I asked him, I said, what did you tell Gorbachev? And he said, well, basically I told him that he could not win the arms race. There was no way he was going to win it, that we would not allow that, he could not win it, and that we should negotiate. I interpret that was that he, in a very silky, soft, nice way, threatened him. Said, look, you can't win it, and we are going to win it. That's the way it's going to be.
The whole summit turned out to be about SDI. It was really remarkable because SDI, they had no money, they had no staff, they were just getting off the ground. It had been a presidential speech, it was a bunch of words. And somehow it just sent the Soviets up the wall.
Встречи были откровенными, продолжительными.
If the United States should find the will and determination to reconsider and evaluate all the ruinous aspects and consequences of the Star Wars program, then the road will be open to a constructive solution of the problem of security.
I guess you know that I've just come from Geneva. It was a constructive meeting, so constructive, in fact, that I look forward to welcoming Mr. Gorbachev to the United States next year. And...
But then Gorbachev, the next summer, sent Reagan a message saying, "I want a quick private meeting with you. I have something to say."
Reagan's decades of conviction will lead him to a pivotal decision at the summit in Reykjavik, Iceland.
Reagan essentially says, "Well, Mr. Gorbachev, what is it that you wanted to see me about, that I've come all the way to Iceland to see you?" And Gorbachev pulled out a plan saying, "I think we should agree to abolish all nuclear warheads, all nuclear delivery systems. Let's change the world." And Reagan is very excited because this is what he's dreamt of as long as he's been thinking about these things, certainly as president, and they begin working on the details.
Gorbachev made all sorts of proposals that basically took giant steps in the direction of the proposals that we had on the table. President Reagan sort of sat there taking in the chips. Of course, our reaction was, this is terrific, keep coming.
Nobody that I know of in the Congress was prepared for what the discussion that took place at the summit. And frankly, I don't think either Reagan or Gorbachev were prepared themselves.
So Reagan has to deal with this amazing dilemma. A Soviet leader is offering him the chance to abolish the nuclear danger in the Soviet Union and the United States, which he had wanted for such a long time. But the cost is going to be to give up something that Reagan also wanted, which was the development of SDI.
I remember Gorbachev saying to the president, "If we destroy all the ballistic missiles, why do you want to have a strategic defense against them?" And the president said, "Because people by this time know how to make them, and you can never tell, some rogue state may get them. And then we need an insurance policy, and you'll need it as much as we do."
Reagan decides that the price of sacrificing SDI is too great. He turns Gorbachev down.
The public saw Reagan and Gorbachev stalking out of that building, and some of them thought there was even going to be some kind of a new Cold War because these were two leaders who were obviously parting in anger.
Gorbachev said something like, "I don't know, Mr. President, what more I could have done." And President Reagan said, "You could have said yes."
He couldn't even sit down. He was so mad. He was walking around. He said, "We came this close, and I don't know why he did that." And he was just really angry about the whole thing.
There was a stubbornness to Reagan when he thought he was right. And the more you sort of pushed him, the more stubborn he became.
The General Secretary wanted wording that in effect would have kept us from developing the SDI for the entire 10 years. In effect, he was killing SDI. And unless I agreed, all that work toward eliminating nuclear weapons would go down the drain. Canceled. I told him I had pledged to the American people that I would not trade away SDI. There was no way I could tell our people their government would not protect them against nuclear destruction.
Reagan felt that the way to deal with Gorbachev was to try to engender trust, but at the same time keep the pressure on Gorbachev to give things up.
On December 8, 1987, Gorbachev comes to Washington to sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, but there are no concessions related to SDI. Reagan's strategy of peace through strength has paid off.
We have listened to the wisdom in an old Russian maxim, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. Mr. General Secretary, though my pronunciation may give you difficulty, the maxim is, doverjai no proverjai, trust but verify.
Назначение этого.
На каждой встрече вы это повторяете.
You repeat that at every meeting.
A few months later, Gorbachev invites Reagan to visit the Soviet Union.
You had a scene that you never expected to see. Ronald Reagan in Red Square walking alongside his friend, the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. And the reporters come up to Reagan, and they're also astounded by what they're seeing. They never could have imagined it.
You still think you're in an evil empire, Mr. President?
No. I can only tell you that we have both agreed that talking to each other instead of about each other is the way to keep out of trouble.
In December of 1988, Ronald Reagan meets his friend Mikhail Gorbachev for the last time as President of the United States. The Soviet Union is still in power. Eastern Europe still suffers behind the Iron Curtain, and the Berlin Wall still stands. But Ronald Reagan has laid the groundwork for a global transformation.
Was Ronald Reagan responsible for the end of the Cold War? We really don't know yet.
It's entirely possible if someone else had been there, it would have happened too. I don't think it would have happened as quickly because there was no one else that was doing it in the way he was doing it.
I think Reagan had an enormous impact. He was not the only president to stand up to the Soviets. I think every president from Truman deserves some of the credit. But Reagan did something unique. He delegitimized the Soviet Union. These were not two superpowers playing this big power game in the world. This is one that stood for good and human rights and decency, and one that stood for repression and aggression and horrendous values.
I think that Reagan was able to end the Cold War and change our relationships with the Soviets because he believed that our policy for the last 40 or 50 years hadn't worked, and he had the strength of his own beliefs to say, I'm going to do it my way. And he did. And he was right.
He made some mistakes, but because of his achievements, the Cold War ended faster and more on peaceful terms than anyone could have imagined.
We meant to change a nation, and instead, we changed the world. Goodbye. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.